Okay, well, welcome everyone to another AZ Ray video. Today we have a very exciting conversation with you guys. We're going to talk about Trigun anime, and I have a very astounding, amazing guest, a great friend of mine, J.C. Hanvi. He's a visual culture researcher, postgraduate researcher as well. He's about to get his PhD. Excited for him about that. And we're here to talk about Trigun, man. So, how are you, Mr. JC Hanvi? How are you? How's everything?
I'm good, man. Thanks. Nice to be here.
Awesome, man. Just yeah, man. You're the one that put me on to this anime, so I felt like you were the perfect guest for this. So, thank you again for your time. And just if you could tell just the viewers and listeners just a little bit about yourself and just how you stumbled onto Trigon.
Yeah, well, as you said, I'm a PhD student. I got about a year and a half left of my PhD, so I kind of work in the field of visual culture. So it's quite a broad, far-reaching field. So I do have a lot of interest in the kind of subtext you find in certain visual media. So I think in my formative years, Trigon was one of those ones that really changed how I thought about the world quite profoundly. So I think from that point, it's always stuck with me, and it'll be interesting today because I'm coming at it from perspective of not watching the whole series for about nearly 20 years now. So, but it's stuck with me to a point that's it's just embedded. So I'm glad you enjoyed it and are willing to talk about it.
No, absolutely. No, thanks again for sharing. And no, there's a lot to it. There's it's the way the anime does a great job, and I did a little bit more research prior to our conversation that apparently the way the anime is depicted and the way the manga is a little different. The manga
Hmm.
is much more like raw and darker in some aspects, but the way the anime director did to kind of portray the same plot, they decided to kind of do like this mystery element and to kind of have the perspective of the insurance agents kind of be like the main perspective of Millie and Meryl, and then to kind of slowly unfold the mystery, which I think they did a good job with it. I was completely okay with it, and I think it was important. But before we delve deeper, just a reminder for the audience: potential spoiler alert warning. We're gonna have timestamps to this video, like we do for all our other AZ Ray videos and interviews, but just for the best viewing experience, probably recommend watching it first. But if you're still curious, you can navigate through the timestamps. But if you don't care, just listen to this whole conversation. But yeah, just to continue back to what I was saying, that I think they did a really good job of like kind of just making it mysterious. It kind of brings you in because you think it's one thing. It's like, oh, okay, it's like a dark Western anime, or like, okay, and then you finally meet this great legend, the whole Vash the Stampede, and it's like, okay, he seems kind of like legit and kind of he seems like scary or whatever, and then you actually see him like, oh, like he is, and then you see he's also a dork too, so there's like a duality to him. It kind of throws off the viewer, and then you start seeing like the view of the world and stuff. It's very interesting, and it's I feel like the environment is also in many ways very relatable because we have we're from different regions of the world, but the way people experience people visiting, whether that's some kind of immigrant or some kind of new type of person they don't like recognize, and as Vash encounters this in the various towns he has to go to, he's always seen as this outsider. He has this stigma to him, the xenophobia to him. So it's kind of interesting kind of seeing that dynamic, and especially being such like a prolific character and whatnot.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, there's so much to unpack there with what you said. I think the first thing, you're right in saying that there's a real suspense to the show within, I think it's not till the fifth episode until we really see what Vash is all about as this kind of old Western gunslinger. Like he is a danger when he wants to be. But I think the most compelling thing about the character for me, especially as a young, maybe was I 13, 14 when I first saw it, was that he completely subverted all those masculine stoic protagonist stereotypes. He's a goofball. He was like overly emotional about the most mundane things, like crying all the time. Uh, but yet he had this real like, how would you put it? A real profound sort of ethics around nonviolence, which was kind of offset by his own inability to handle his inhibitions. Like he just eats donuts and gets drunk and makes a fool of himself. Um, and yet, when he meets a character like Wolfwood, he's quite critical of him, saying your ethics are quite poor. And but then Wolfwood becomes quite a prominent character, and Vash realizing that there are limits to his pacifism that he cannot reconcile. So there's so many layers. And another thing you mentioned, that this kind of alienation that he experiences in other cities. That's for me at the core of what this show's all about. Is that he's a guy who doesn't fit anywhere. He's not even human. Spoiler. And he's he is kind of the epitome of what solidarity is about. It's about being othered in every possible facet of your life and recognizing that in other people. That's where compassion comes from, and that's his whole forte. So yeah.
No, yeah, you brought up a lot of interesting points and interesting characters, and yeah, big spoiler. He's not technically human, right? Yeah. Um, I guess we can get into it. Why not? You mentioned it. Yeah, he's like some kind of like alien plant, which is
Yeah,
interesting
yeah.
within its own right. And it's like the writers did an amazing job with that own poetry, right? It's almost you can see it in a couple different ways, right? Does he does he represent the plants, and does his counterpart twin represent like almost the vengeance of the plants, and like this, because the fact that like they've been disregarded and disrespected for a millennia plus, right? And just they're seen as like the bottom of the food chain, when technically speaking, if it weren't for them, there wouldn't be a food chain, right? So like the
Mm.
disrespect that plants get disregarded too. And then yeah, you touched on Wolfwood. Yeah, he's between him and Millie, they're my two favorite characters. And it's kind of funny that they end up being a romantic thing.
Yeah,
Um
yeah.
and yeah, no, and then Wolfwood's character within his own right, touches in religion and some kind of like cult like group that like recruits him, and it's just so sad because he's an orphan, right? And like I don't think this gets talked about enough, but the like the power that adults have on children, and especially a children that's very malleable and like doesn't have an understanding on the world. And when this kid gets approached because he's special and he has like natural like talents and athleticism and skills, instead of fostering it to something positive, they ended up fostering him to be like this amazing like marksman and essentially a skilled hitman, sorry.
Mm.
And they start like building up his skills, and it's heartbreaking because you can tell even as a character that he doesn't even like what he does. He's not at peace with what he does, and that
Mm.
he still tries to be the thing that I think he wanted, right? Because he
Mm.
helps other children. He tries to foster them. Every time kids are in kind of danger, he's always making sure like he's a good, like quote unquote, like I don't even know what you'd call that. Some kind of foster transplant parent, dad. Make sure they have food. He's make sure they're okay. Because that's probably all he wanted, right? As an orphan, right? I don't think if given the choice, did he want to be recruited in this secret organization of hitmen? Probably not, right? But then, or maybe he did, but he didn't know any better, right? He was a kid. I think all of us think that stuff sounds cool until you're in it, right? Like James Bond sounds cool until you're probably in. I'm like, oh, dude, you got to kill everybody. like, like they
Exactly. Yeah.
romanticize this idea that it's probably great, but it's probably not, right? And so I think it's interesting too, to your point, because although Vash and Wolfwood are very similar, but their responses to the world, right? Pacifism. Because I would argue that Wolfwood is pacifist to some extent, but then he feels like there's
To a
like,
point, yeah.
yeah, there's a level where it's like, no, you like, come on, man, like you have to. There has to be a line. But then again, too, Wolfwood is just one of many characters that constantly challenges Vash, right? The other people of the gun ho gang that Knives is ahead of, right? And he organizes all these different people. They all have their different philosophies, all their different ways, And then to your earlier point, how like philosophical it is, it's there's a lot going on there. The whole plan thing, people constantly challenging Vash, and he constantly is being tested, especially as the loner that eventually kind of gets friends, but he's loner throughout most of it. And just to keep everyone on the same page, in case you haven't seen the anime and you're listening to this, you're like, what the hell are they talking about? So, like, to give you like a short, brief summary of it, it's basically the story of like of a of a of a lone gunman who's kind of seen as this big threat to this planet, but then we end up realizing that he's not. And then you can see that this planet's like struggling for resources, and there's various corrupt people that are like trying to manipulate it. And in the head of it all, or in the head of like the people that are committing the crimes and the bandits, is ironically the main character's Vash's twin brother, who is just wants to destroy all humanity and destroy and suck up all the resources, because he is heartbroken because they had a third brother that was experimented and killed on because of their experiments. So it made him, it shifted him from being like this introverted person to like this character of just like vengeance. And so Wolfwood, we don't know that he's a villain. Another spoiler alert. He ends up being affiliated with Knives. So just to kind of give the audience an idea. So what we're talking about, Vash is the main protagonist. Wolfwood is kind of like this. He's kind of in the middle. He's
It's like a mercenary sort of character, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like because he wants to help Vash, but he knows his duty is to potentially either kill Vash or give the whereabouts to Knives, his boss, right? And then he ends up ultimately making the quote unquote right moral choice and starts seeing, just opening his eyes as he sees more in the world, that like, oh no, I'm part of the bad thing, right? And that's a whole deeper concept within itself. I don't think enough people even realize that within their own cities, within their own countries, that sometimes like we're biased and we don't even see our own bias. We can't even recognize our own bias. And sometimes we're like, hey, even though maybe our government doesn't represent us, but are we aware that sometimes the propaganda like makes us think that, oh no, we're the good guys and we're these guys? And it's like, but are you? Are
That's
you?
a great point. Yeah, yeah. Like one of the things that frustrates me when people do videos on Trigun is that they always emphasize the pacifism as the kind of core element of the show. But for me, it was kind of like, we talked before coming on here. For me, it was Meryl and her position as basically a journalist and uh, insurance agent who has to follow Vash and basically mitigate what chaos ensues around him, but also clean up insurance claims. So, in a sense, that the hysteria around Vash, who is ultimately not a threat whatsoever, the hysteria around him is generating this economy that obviously there's a company profiteering off of this. The people, the poor, destitute, are profiting off this. So, in a sense, what we're talking about, it's good that you brought up the plant thing, because for me, are we talking about nuclear power here? Like, is it a deterrent in that sense, or are we talking about ecological crisis and scarcity of resources? It may be a dual meaning there, but maybe that's just me.
Well, that's a good point. And then you're reminding me of an earlier conversation we had about the economy of catastrophe, right?
Yeah, yeah.
How people benefit, man. Like there's benefactors in catastrophe. Who's orchestrating the catastrophe? Who's creating the illusion of catastrophe? Like the fact that you are guilty and still proven innocent, instead of innocent still proven guilty, be like, hey, we don't like that this person is gravitating all this attention towards them, right? And most of it, as you realize, it's not of his own doing. Maybe it kind of is, but it's not because he's causing the harm. He is
Mhm.
ending the harm. And sometimes because of how destructive his opponents are, that are the quote unquote real bandits, it leaves a lot of damage and whatnot too. But then that also says a lot about the people that are part of this knives game that are so destructive, right? But there's a lot of hidden poetry within that too, right? How like yeah, and going back to the fact that like Vash is technically a plant, and I would argue that knives as gangs and grunts and mercenaries are have a disregard towards nature and a disregard towards plants. There's no respect, and it's like it doesn't matter, right? Because the objective is the objective. So I know, yeah, it gets pretty dark with that, with the whole back and forth about their disregard and respect to humanity, and then just the economy of catastrophe.
Yeah, I suppose we should note as well that Vash has this bounty on his head from the start of the series, 60 billion double dollars. So he's obviously got this bounty on him. He's sought after, but within a few episodes, it's immediately kind of null and void because Meryl says, "Oh no, if you're humanoid, they call you the humanoid typhoon. You're a natural disaster. You're not human. Like, how can we possibly make a claim because you're not a person inflicting damage on another person?" So it becomes this kind of weird, as you say, like an economy of catastrophe in that sense, where people are reliant on natural disasters and maybe war and chaos and killing to profit and make their money. So, and we see this in mainstream media every day. Like it kind of keeps the money flowing. So,
That's true, right? Like drama sells, right? Like
mm.
reality TV shows, tribalism in politics, right? It's much easier to divide people than unite people,
Oh,
right?
we know all about that here. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's no, it's tricky times, right? It's like, yeah, it's yeah, yeah, might as well talk about it since you said we know about that here. I think it's a perfect example, right? Um, me being Mexican, and then J.C. O'Hainfaig, of Irish descent, and from Ireland. So we have different viewpoints, but not so dissimilar because we're next to do different borders, right? We got good old friendly Trump in the U.S., and then we have Ireland that is not even completely Ireland, right? We have the whole controversial North Ireland defense stuff and whatnot, and then and I'm oversimplifying a very complex issue, but just to kind of give the general audience like an understanding of it, and not so differently that big issues become political issues, even if we don't want them to be political, just because politics, whether we like it or not, it seeps its role in everything. It's everywhere, right? I would even argue that this show was also very political because of just the layers to it, right? Like we have, like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of wealthy people. The fact that there's even wealthy people in this desolate world doesn't even make sense. It's like, all right, well, someone is literally like hoarding the resources, right? They're not
Mm.
being fair, right? And then the fact that like the government's willing to pay people like this big money for capturing criminals, like is that really the productive way of like rehabilitating or like helping the economy, right? And it's forcing people to have like this natural xenophobia towards each other, because it's like, what if your face is wanted, then instead of me understanding you, instead of me listening to you, instead of me even like hearing your point, it's like, no, judge, jury, executioner, like that's it, right? Just because someone else stamped this scarlet letter, this stigma on you, you have to listen, right? And so the reason I bring this up too, since you said like we know all about this here, it made me think of like the recent controversy that's been happening. Like I guess Conor McGregor, right?
Uh,
He used to be Ireland's favorite son, but then just I don't know him personally. I don't know what the heck you could say exactly, but maybe fame, drugs, everything kind of got to him. And then I don't know, he doesn't even seem like the same person that he is now. And the fact that very recently, since it's March 22nd, the time of this recording, about a week from St. Patrick's Day, it's actually a very common tradition for the president of Ireland to meet with whoever is the current U.S. president to just talk about different current issues and just talk about their connected history, since a lot of Irish people are in the United States and arguably founded America and whatnot. So just kind of like to maintain those political ties. And for whatever reason, um, the Trump cabinet decided to pick McGregor because for some reason McGregor, his whole recent scandal with Nikita Ham, like it was talked about, but because of all these because of the wars have been drowning out the news, his scandal was just kind of a side note. When in Ireland and the UK, it's been completely different.
Mm.
To their scandal took over the world because of probably of what that figure meant to them because he's closer to home there. So what he was doing in the whole controversy, whether he did it or not, that's not the point of it. But the fact that he even put himself in that position just says a whole lot about his whole mental state and whatever that was, right? Let's say he was innocent. Not that we're choosing sides or not that we want to even get into that, but just the whole embarrassment of that whole situation. And then he talks about these issues of that are happening in Ireland, and it's interesting too how, and I'm trying to find the connection here, but it's not too dissimilar to Vash the Stampede being like this, having this stigma, being this like wanted person, right? When we have the luxury in the Conor McGregor scenario that we know more about him, in the Vash, in the Vash in the Vash circumstances, the only two people, or maybe three people, not know him the best are probably Meryl, Millie, probably Wolfwood, and maybe Merlin, the guy that makes him his guns. Maybe that's like the only people that kind of quote unquote know him. Probably
Mm.
Knives too. So five people, a handful of people, right? But it's interesting how like sometimes we have these cult of personalities that kind of suck up the room. And the only reason I'm bringing up the Conor McGregor too is just kind of to kind of give you guys an understanding in case if you didn't see like the anime. That's kind of like a current event that you can have this idea that he's this big figure that captures the world's attention and this and then their imagination and whatnot. Because like you're seeing all that, so you're seeing how whether we want it or not, these people are like influential, right? So yeah, I don't know. I kind of said a lot, but what are your thoughts on that, Mr. J.C. Humvee?
Well, yeah, I think there's an element as well, like, if we can bring it back to Trigun a bit, the overarching story of the series is that they are on this planet in the first place because of an effect of deep space colonization. So it's really an effect of imperialism, and what we're seeing with McGregor and certain far right elements in the Republic of Ireland is, the effects of what nationalism does as a result of these things. So all of a sudden, Irish people are white in the contemporary world, and they become kind of uh, essentialist in that sense. So, but yeah, I think there's an element of like the remnants of colonialism. I think we could probably talk about if we're getting into these sorts of, exceptionalism, these ideas of, I don't know, expansionism, and yeah, who knows? There's a lot going on.
But yeah, going back to the whole, we don't have to get too political for on the conversation, but it's like I said earlier, there's like parallels to it and stuff. But the way we can get political without getting too political, um, just like any good villain, what are your thoughts on Knives? And do you
Mm.
think Knives' viewpoint was it understood? I guess on that level is political. You can kind of like go over what you thought he was. Was his vengeance righteous? Did he overdo it? What are your thoughts overall on his character? Because he does end up redeeming himself. Spoiler
Mhm.
alert as well too. So what are your thoughts on, or maybe why was Knives the way he was? Right.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this is where the manga can be quite useful, is because you start to see a lot of the childhood trauma that both of them experienced. I say childhood, but they were, these kind of interdimensional beings or whatever. So, um, yeah, you start to realize that two shifts, like they're twins, so essentially they're the same person genetically. So, a fork happened in the road where Vash followed Rem's idea of compassion and hospitality, and Knives, through whatever abuses he went through, went the other way and said, okay, I'm going to destroy humanity. I think they're awful, yada, yada, yada. Again, we can maybe go back and talk about the element of, are we talking about nuclear deterrence here? Is this, um, a nuclear deterrent is for the purposes of keeping the peace, but on the other hand of that, it can completely destroy humanity. So I'm seeing that between Vash and Knives. So I think, in some sense, if you understand it through the lens of a childhood trauma, I think he's perhaps a sympathetic villain. Uh, and also, Vash has his own dark side, which comes out now and again through depression. That's kind of the other end of that, uh, which is again worth unpacking if you have time. But yeah, I think that Knives for me is definitely justified. Whether or not it's right or wrong is another question. But um, yeah, what do you think?
What do I think about Knives? It's hard to say. It's hard to say because he's technically not a human, right? So their concept of like morals and their understanding of the world too. But then again, maybe I'm giving him an excuse. I'm giving him an out because he's not technically human. Maybe I shouldn't give him an out by saying like, I don't know, is it right or wrong? Is it? I think it goes a little deeper than right or wrong when I think of Knives. I think it's huh. There's like a psychological scarring, post traumatic stress dynamic that happens, and they both responded to it differently, right? So, for the listener, for the viewer of this video, let me just paint a picture for you. It's you and two siblings, right? And let's say in this scenario, the oldest sibling gets killed right in front of you, right? For this scenario, let's assume you're the youngest sibling, and then we'll say the other person will represent Knives will be the middle sibling. So your older sibling just died in front of you, right? And we're pretending for this scenario, you, the viewer, you're the youngest sibling, and you end up being Vash. And he does what most people do in these scenarios, right? It's either flee or fight. And Vash chooses to flee away and kind of run away and be like reserved or just kind of almost be like any normal kid, right? Like traumatized and react, but like kind of flee away. But Knives chooses to fight, right? And it's another natural response. So that's why I almost kind of think of it almost like an animal response or like because it's one of those things, right? It's tricky. I don't even know if morals are even fair, right? Because the whole circumstance was even unfair from the very beginning, right? These are two experimented beings. So the whole like I think we threw out fair a long time ago, right? And yeah, it's when you asked me the question, I couldn't help but think of my older brothers. And we grew up in a very gang infested area, right? And we grew up in the high racial tension of the 90s and a lot of drunk crime, gun crime, and most of the people that were the police in our areas when they felt like policing were part of neo Nazis and these like Aryan KKK bands that just loved um, like making minorities fight each other. They would even like threaten to deport people just to see like just these very sadistic, chaotic people. So when I think of this scenario, I kind of think of my brothers where they were labeled as gang members for a long period of time, but they weren't. They never joined a gang. They just defended themselves because of the situations. And a lot of people in my neighborhood died unjustly. A lot of my friends died unjustly for no just for walking while being brown or whatever. It wasn't necessarily just brown people, but I'm speaking from my perspective as a brown person. But yeah, other people of color, African American descent or Afro Latino descent, even people of like Southeastern Asian descent, just because they look different, just because of whatever, we got caught up in like just whatever the world paradigm was, you know what I mean? So that they're like casualties. So I would argue that Vash and Knives are just the casualties in these BS circumstances.
Hmm.
And we're just seeing the results of it. I don't know, right and wrong. I don't know. But then again, too, I I don't, I think the world is much more gray than we want to even like realize. Like, I'm
Big
not
time.
saying
Yeah.
that ethics aren't a thing. Of course they are. There is right and wrong. I do deeply believe that, but there's like something in the middle of right and wrong too. I don't know what you'd even call it. There's a
Well,
void there. What would you
yeah,
say?
I think that's where these gaps start to appear in between these particular ends of the spectrum. That's where, like I talked about earlier, that's where solidarity starts to emerge, and I think that's a lot of uh, what Buddhism tries to put across. If we get into religion now, like that's their whole thing is about the middle way. It's not being one extreme or the other, not being ascetic or uh, cave into your desires or anything like that. It's kind of straight down the middle, and in that sense, there's a conservatism to it, but in a good way. Like it's not traditionalist. It's kind of this kind of free flowing acceptance of suffering and what that brings, but understanding that other people have that exact same subjective experience. So I think a lot of it comes out in Vash, to be honest, because you really see every aspect of his personality. I think he's one of the most, well formed lead characters in any series I've seen, because from the get go you see every facet of the joy he experiences, but also the depths of depression. And I'm not sure if it's mentioned in the anime, but in the manga, like there's a suicide attempt and all this sort of stuff. And he's a very dark character, but also has a lot of optimism, and he kind of straddles that back and forth quite well. So I don't know. I think you're right. I think there is this kind of middle gray area that we need to just accept and let wash over us in some sense. And in a lot of ways, that's what Vash does in the film in the series.
Oh, you bring up a great point with the conservatism of Buddhism. There's a lot, and I know you mean conservatism, how like you conserve and preserve the self. I know you don't mean it like in the political ideology.
Oh no.
That's a good point because to your point, a lot of other people that make commentaries on Trigun like hit home too much of the pacifism and maybe don't analyze it enough or don't realize, to your point, like what conservatism really is, right? That's like um it's yeah, I think it's even hard for like a Western audience to even understand, right? To analyze yourself and to know your limitations, to know whatever goals and ideals you have are sufficient and that you don't need to strive for more. You can have more goals, but they're not absolutely necessary. You can be content with what you have and what you are because you are enough and that is enough. But not to get all spiritual and whatnot, but there is a deep ideology with that. And yeah, with because yeah, to your point, Vash is very human, just like everyone else, right? I think all the main characters kind of like struggle with this, and I think it's the reason why I like Millie so much because she's like kind of has that like that that character that she's like kind of like that ditzy, but then she's like seemingly smart. um,
Yeah,
sure.
Millie's like the junior colleague of Meryl Strife, isn't she? So
Yes,
kind
yes.
of shadowing Meryl as like the the main character in that scenario. But yeah, she's an interesting one.
Yeah, dude, I'm blanking out. I was trying to remember the show. There's that detective that like he makes himself seem like he was dumb in the 80s, but then he's really smart and figures everything out.
Oh God, what's his
Shoot,
name?
yeah, what the heck's his name? Oh man, this is gonna bug me. Uh, uh, but yeah, yeah, she's an amazingly likable character for that. And then I've always been a fan of people that like kind of have like duality to them in the sense that like I think to your point, it's probably just how Columbo. There we go,
Columbo, yeah, yeah, yeah,
Columbo,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
dude.
That's a good,
I,
good Irish man. Good Irish name there,
there you
Columbo.
go. Dude, he was oh man, he was amazing. I saw it in Spanish. I still never seen it in English, but I saw it dubbed in me and my parents love that. We still have like an inside joke amongst our family, just like when we mess around with each other, like, where were you November 8th at 5 p.m.? We get all like rush to each other just to mess around, just like playful interrogation. But going back to what you're saying about how like well it's written and how Vash is so relatable, and I think Millie is too, because I think we forget in life, or even as we observe different, mediums, whether you're reading a book, art, regardless, or music, film, shows, or in this case, an anime or manga. Like, I think we forget that people are allowed to have layers to them, duality, plurality, whatever it is. Like, yeah, a ditzy person can also be smart. Yeah, you know what I mean?
Mm.
You're allowed to have moments of a lapse of judgment. Like we forgot Columbo. It doesn't mean we're not too highly intelligent people, or maybe I don't know. Maybe we don't have to consider ourselves intelligent. Maybe we're average intelligence, but
Well,
regardless,
that's the interesting thing about intelligence. If you want to talk about IQ, it's like you can have a high IQ, but you can learn incorrect information at a very high rate, you know.
that's
So
true.
that's the issue with IQ. It's like there are very smart people out there, and a lot of them are in certain political regimes that are quite prominent in the news right now. But it doesn't mean that they have correct information about their lives and what people need. And so it's a bit of a red herring, I think, intelligence in that
That's a good.
sense. But
No, it's a good point. That's a good point. And then that's another thing too, right? Sometimes the best speaker in the room is only just that, and sometimes we think that the best speaking person is the most intelligent, the most qualified person, and things like that. But sometimes it almost it's its form. It's almost its own form of treachery, right? It kind of it messes with you. And yeah, especially in this day and age when we have access to like internet and medium, it's very easy to be quote unquote tricked or swayed into another side. That's another element that I think would be interesting to kind of get into as we're going into like different elements of the film. I'm sorry, of the anime, is of how do you think the Vash notoriety spread in a world where they may have had internet or technologies in the past, but it was lost? Do you really think it was all word of mouth that really spread this legend?
yeah, well, if you think back to like, I'm not an expert on this by any means, but if you think back to the actual Old West of the frontier in America, I do think from my own reading, like very brief reading, that there was an element of like gamesmanship between gunslingers in that sense. So I think it's reasonable to think that in a slightly less advanced civilization in terms of like communication, that could happen on a broad scale. Like you talk about the American frontier at that time, it's just vast nothingness to a point, you know. Um, so I think if there's enough of a hysteria being built up around one man, it'd be reasonable to think that it would be the other way, that people would avoid him. But in this sense, I think people are seeking him because of what he actually is. He's a resource, he's a source of power, um, a source of energy. So I think maybe there's a dual thing going on there as well. That he may be a very notorious gunslinger, but he's also a very scarce natural resource on a dying planet. So
Interesting. Hmm. That's a good point. And to tie it back with your earlier comment of nuclear deterrence, are you referring to like Vash himself literally being the nuclear deterrent? Like he's literally the walking atomic bomb? Is that what you're
or
alluding to?
like yeah, like or at least a representation of what that is in reality.
Interesting.
But as well, I think probably the closest comparison in terms of a famous film series to plants would be what happens in the Matrix with humanity. They become
Oh,
these
sure.
batteries basically. So you uh, think of humanity leaving Earth, seeking to colonize deep space, and what's their source of power? Oh, we find these interdimensional beings that we enslave basically to use them as our batteries to get there. So there's an ethics around that happening as well. It's like, okay, this is an acceptable thing to do, but this is what's happened throughout human history. Like plantations, whatnot. So,
Sure. No, yeah.
um,
Yeah, the definition of colonization, pretty much, right? All the resources that were taken from various empires and other countries throughout the world. Wow.
yeah, that's immediately where my mind goes. It's like, Vash and Knives, in a sense, are victims. They're descendants of the victims of this colonization process that's happened, and that's ultimately led to this no man's land world that he finds himself in. So,
That's a great way of putting it. Because if we're looking at knives and Vash, the yin and yang polar opposites, and let's just imagine them like they're two nuclear bombs. You're right. One nuclear bomb's like, hey, I don't want to hack Vash being the person like, hey, I don't want to kill these people. I don't want to have to kill these people. I want to avoid it by any means necessary. But his presence alone, because he's a walking bomb, it
mhm,
does what it'll create reactions like both physical and literal and relationship reactions, right? And then we have knives that just leans into the bomb angle and just like, no, I'm walking talking destruction, right? And
mhm.
feels that it's just right. So that's wow, that's a powerful symbolism, and that's an interesting way of seeing it that way for sure.
I
And now
think that
that I
is what's going on.
remember.
Like if you
Mhm.
think about nuclear deterrence, I mentioned earlier that in a sense they're meant to keep the peace. When another nation has an arsenal of nuclear bombs, oh, we'll make ours so that they don't bomb us and we can't retaliate. So it's kind of like once nations know that that's a thing, that filters down and creates a hysteria on the ground. And what do we use if we can't use nuclear bombs? We use guns, we use weapons, we kill each other in that way. So, in one sense, yes, it's true. It stops us from destroying ourselves. But on the other hand, it creates this kind of insidious sort of violence that's hard to escape from. But the other, as you say, the other flip side of that is, we can't just destroy ourselves, and that's kind of the history of Vash in the series is that he destroyed a city um, by being kind of coerced into doing it by knives, and that's kind of the backstory that his amnesia kind of leads out. He remembers his childhood, but the reality is that he caused a nuclear blast that destroyed the city, so he has to reconcile with that.
Sure, and that's a an interesting thought in general, right? Could a could an atomic bomb feel remorse? And I guess this show argues that it could, right? Because I
Mm-hmm.
guess in a biochemical level, a bomb is a living thing, right? It sounds weird to think about it because because of chemistry, you think it like it becomes so. I guess it seems unnatural, so we lose the connection. But in every step of the in every step of the process, everything that's being used is alive. It's the only way that it works, and like it gets combusted into a controlled space and it gets released, right? And through it being released, it's alive again, and then radiation technically is part of the waves that live on us forever as an energy that's coexisting, so it's technically always there, right?
Mm.
So that's a wow, that's a very interesting and wow, wow. So I get that you know right now, you're an older gentleman, right? You have, you're married, you have your kids and whatnot, and then finishing up your PhD and stuff. But as a kid, did you understand how profound um like this series was? Did it impact you, or did you have to like watch it again? Did you go into the manga later, or how did it impact you then? Because the fact that you can even say all these names top of head, top of mind from something way back then, I could tell that it's like part of it's maybe part of your identity, or you just have a deep connection with it. So how was your relationship with it?
That's a great question. I think it's probably to do with, where I was born and where I was raised. And I'm from Belfast, so I'm what you call a ceasefire baby. So I was born around the time of the IRA ceasefire, early 90s. I think it's 94. I was born in 92. And growing up, it was still a period, still the troubles, it's still a period of conflict. And Uh, I remember the Good Friday Agreement signed, the peace agreement being signed, April '98, and then the country or the region was filled with hope, and everyone was optimistic about, okay, we've actually managed to create an environment in which everyone can feel at home, and and there's a prospect of choosing our destiny in some sense as a collective. And then maybe 6 months later, 15th of August 1998 was the Omen bomb, and it was the worst atrocity of the Troubles. And all of a sudden, I just got ripped to shreds, all that hope. So I think in some sense, it's ingrained from a young age that I remember these things happening. I remember being kind of protected from religion, thankfully. But as you get older, you start to realize that this is what these kind of particularist cultures do to each other. They find difference and they start to perform themselves more. So for me, watching this as a teenager, I think I was so compelled by the non-violent aspect of it, because that was such a big part, in hindsight, what I understand now, such a big part of the Good Friday Agreement was all about committing to non-violence and demilitarizing. Um, so yeah, that was the main compelling point of it for me, and seeing how especially Vash struggles with that ethically. Like, as we mentioned earlier on, there are limits to non-violence. It's like, at what point do you need to consider your own subjective well-being when maintaining these ideologies, or these? That's what it is. It's an ideology. Um, so yeah, maybe that's kind of the seeds of it started in my childhood, growing up here, and then the series probably just ramped all that up philosophically and was like, yeah, it's quite a. I think as well, like being into art and being an artist back then, I think I was looking for ways in which to express quite complex, layered issues in ways that weren't violent and that weren't politically divisive in that sense. So I think through film and through art and through TV series and things, music, that all came quite apparent very quickly. Nice transition.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, because we're getting to know Mr. J.C. O'Hainfaig deeper, and it's important. So I thought the transition was fitting. Um, just to pick your brain a little bit more about what you're saying about your experience, and it's interesting. We're from two different regions of the world, but we had two different destructive '90s relationships, regardless, right? Tumultuous times, even if it's two different regions of the world. But uh, to your point, going back to your art background and artist and doing what you do in visual culture, can you explain a little bit to the audience what is visual culture? And maybe we can use Trigun to make it like a digestible example in case people aren't caught up with like, different types of art or different genres of art and things like that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I suppose at the most superficial level, you can read it as um, kind of an investigation into how cultures express themselves through visual media. But I kind of like to take that a step further, break it down a bit. If you take the term visual culture and the constituent parts of that, you think visual is to do with sight and seeing. But if you take it back to the Latin root, video, it's all about seeing is knowing. So perception is the knowledge we get from the world. And then if you take culture, like what would you say culture is? Like the beliefs and values and expressions of a particular people, a collective of particular people. Within that, for me, when we're talking about particulars, we mentioned this earlier, cultures define themselves by what is different to them. They need other cultures to define themselves against. So within that, there's an inherent alienation that I think is, a foundation of everybody in the world. That's the source of compassion for me and subjectivity. Um, so in that sense, there's alienation between the subject and the culture, the hegemonic culture above them, and then there's alienation between cultures in that sense. So for me, visual culture is very much about, or at least the way I interpret it, it's very much about how our perceptions fuel knowledge about our subjective, alienated nature in the world, and the kind of the material and economic things that happen around to influence that. So I think you can see that playing out in Trigun. If we're talking a lot about this kind of no man's land planet, this barren environment that's affecting these people to cause chaos, and it creates this cycle of catastrophe. There are elements within Trigun that speak to violence and non-violence. There are elements that speak to religion, elements that speak to westerns and the old west of America and colonization. So there's a lot that you can extract from any superficial image. There's always a subtext to it, and that's kind of what I do in my research. But mine's more contextually based around Northern Irish stuff. So.
Oh yeah, thanks for sharing that. No, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because yeah, everything visual, there's that always a deeper layer to it, right? But yeah, for us to see everything superficially, right? Like even like there's something more to it, right? Whether it's through somebody creating work of art, whether you look at, I don't know, like let me see. I don't know. We look at this Van Gogh reimagining, right? Oops, trying
Oh,
to
nice.
get that.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. But just an idea, right? Like, yeah, you can say it, oh, it's just a cool painting, but you dig deeper, right? Hey, what do the colors mean? What do the nuance means, right? Why did they just choose these colors for that guitar, right? Everything has like deeper purposes and things like that too, once you analyze deeper. But to talk a little bit about your other comment too about the West and stuff and how that the way that's interpreted and in general and being someone who's Mexican of descent and the complicated relationship with the Wild West, right? Because arguably the Wild West was the stolen lands of Mexico and various indigenous tribes, and because of James Polk, the American president, being determined for his manifest destiny and creating all these conflicts that was through the Alamo, through Texas, and then eventually making fake riots and paying soldiers to like pretend to be Mexican and like do all these fake little riots and fights and be like, oh, we have to start a war with Mexico. And while Mexico was in the midst of starting a revolution. And
Mm.
so, they timed it perfect. They got the land, and then right after that land, after that war, Mexico went through its own revolution because it was going to do it anyways. They're already upset because there was still Spanish, French, Portuguese people that were still in power and still had the political ties. And it's like, hey, no, we're Mexico. We're not New Spain anymore, and or whatever. And so yeah, that whole series of conflicts and stuff. And just to wrap it up back to Trigon, I think there's like a theme of like false promises, right? No, not too dissimilar to what you were talking about earlier about the peace agreement or the Good Friday agreement, how this was supposed to be a shift, a change, right? And how the West, a lot of people forget that that's actually the reason of the American Civil War, right? Because the North and the South couldn't agree on what they wanted to do with this new land. Well, everyone's like, oh, let's make them slave states. No, let's make some slave states. No, let's make them free. Let's not. And that created the conflict because both delegations couldn't come to equal footing around it, right? And in that way, too, it reminds me of another book. I know we touched on it. I know you haven't read it yet, but recommend it to any viewer or listener that Cormac McCarthy's The Blood Meridian. It talks about the West in a very dark historical way, and it's very raw and dark. And in many ways, this anime and manga is too, but the comic reliefs kind of helps you decompress
Yeah.
once you actually analyze, like, dude, these people are struggling, they're suffering, they're dying, they have like no resources, and all these little, I don't know, tribal leaders, gang leaders are just causing mischief all over the dang place.
Mm.
And these people are just trying to survive, man. They could care
I'll plug
less.
another book. I'll plug another book while we're here. Is
Please.
Slavoj Zizek's Violence,
Okay.
because he gets into he kind of breaks down violence into three categories, and one is subjective violence, like what we're talking about as far as I suppose you could put terrorism under that bracket, where there's an identifiable agent that does awful things to someone, and then there's objective systemic violence, which is a bit more insidious and hard to track. and usually systemic acts as a scapegoat for the objective. So um, I think there's definitely an element of that going on in Trigun that we've unpacked a little bit as far as economies of catastrophe and all that sort of thing. The underlying kind of colonial exploits of the rich of humanity going to this planet. So yeah, I think I highly recommend the book, but I think there's a lot more going on that meets the eye, both in real life and in
Absolutely.
Trigun.
What can you read out the book in case someone's listening? Can you read out like the name of the book?
Yeah, it's Slavoj Zizek's Violence.
Cool. Thank you again. Just in case, yeah, definitely. Wow, yeah, you definitely uh intrigued my interest. Is the person Polish? Polish, right?
He's
Polish name?
from Slovenia.
Oh, so okay, so not too far
Yeah,
away
yeah.
from the central area. Okay. Oh
Hmm.
yeah, that's its own thing too, man. Slovenia has been
Speaking
patty
of
caked.
slaves, yeah, Slavs, yeah,
Yeah,
they've had their own thing going on down there.
yeah. And then from the Soviet Union too, they've always been stuck in the middle, like all the not too different from like Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan. It's like, hey, come this way. It's like, do we have to? We're technically more Asian than that, but it's like it's one of those weird things just because of I don't know resources and historical reimaginings, like how you're saying politically, right? And yeah, and the term Slav, right?
Hmm.
It can either be a negative connotation or for some people, like that's arguably the whole reason of the Ukraine Russian war, right? Of who's the true Slavic region, whatever the hell that means.
Uh,
And it's heartbreaking because it's no different. It's almost like a Scottish person arguing with an Irish person. Like, dude, you guys are genetically cousins. It's been proven
yeah,
through a
literally
millennia.
tribes documented called the Scoti who moved to Ireland. Like, yeah,
Like
that's what
it's
happened.
literally documented, right? But then they swear, and it's more heartbreaking than it is to like not to even pick on anybody. It's like, but dude, that's like literally your like, it's heartbreaking when things like that happen, and it's just like you know what I mean. And yeah, to your point, yeah, systemic violence. Oof, I think that's the big underlining thing that we've been talking about throughout, right? And we're talking about how Vash and Knives are literally the victims of systemic violence and how the poorer citizens or just the regular day citizens are the victims of systemic violence and how Meryl and Millie don't even realize that they're either proponents of systemic violence or they're like their companies profit through the violence arguably in a way, right? And so yeah, it's one of those things that um a lot of things are grosser once you dive a little deeper, right? And like you and I met, you and I met in university, and like yeah, we appreciate university. Education is a beautiful idea too, but it also has its dark elements to it because of how badly structured the government has departments of education and subsidies and all this stuff, that universities have to become real estate companies instead of profiting off of like a normal traditional trade system where you have pipelines where students could go into different companies and do different things, which I think it should be done. I don't know why it hasn't and it isn't being done, right? But it creates all these like unnecessary things and it becomes systemic violence. And especially because all these things are out of our control, right? Unless you're in a position of power or influence and all that. But no, yeah, wow. No, I'm definitely gonna check that out, dude. Thanks for.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah, it's
always a
good.
sucker for a good, sociological or social cultural research because, yeah, there's a lot of things that are at play in our everyday lives that are so subtle that it's kind of scary, right? And I think
Uh-huh.
it's the reason too why, 'cause, you and I are similar in age. Um, it almost reinforces our natural skepticism of the world that we have around us, right? Because it's like you can't BS us, man. Like we
Yeah,
live through
yeah,
it. And so when you're kind of naturally suspicious, skeptical of different things, you know what I mean? It's like everything that you're saying. And, before even reading that book, I'm like, okay, I think I'm really going to enjoy that book, you know?
yeah, yeah. And it's a short form book too, so it's very digestible. And yeah, he's a really good thinker. admittedly a communist and very forthright about that. A lot of Hegel, a lot of those old German, like continental philosophers. So really worth reading. I think it'll
Interesting.
expand your mind.
No, sure. And then that's another word that gets like bastardized too, right? Communist, because like we've never seen communism and people disrespect communism and Marxism, but it's like it's never happened. They've all become like, oh, let's be Marxist, and like, just kidding, dictatorship. It's like it's never the whole concept
Yeah,
of it hasn't worked. But I would argue the reason why communism hasn't worked is because I don't think it's made to work on a big scale.
no, it's
I
not meant to
think
be centralized in that way.
right, right, and that's a whole another thing. When you're too big, I think that's also another problem. Another thing too. I think there's a and I think that also gets to your earlier comment when you talk about nuclear deterrence. That the other thing about nuclear deterrence that it's like it's the only thing that you get taken seriously as a country. Like if you don't
Mm.
have nuclear deterrence, if you don't have any kind of nuclear weapons, you're not really considered a country because you can't sustain yourself, right? So it becomes like another layer of things too, right? And it forces countries to like if you don't want to be taken as like a third world country or not taken seriously, then you have to create nuclear weapons or at least make an attempt that you can have that technology because if you don't, you won't be taken seriously and you're not going to be part of those big UN NATO conversations, which we starting to realize more and more is just part of warmongering. It's not too dissimilar, right? And the truth is that their illusion of peace is still through war, right? And is who can profit off the war and who can, yeah, it's heartbreaking. It truly is, right? And like yeah, especially with the whole like European alliance, right? And how it's like kind of slowly falling apart and we're seeing it deteriorate in different countries and we're seeing like arguably the fall of Germany and France, which were like long-stead strong economies and strong countries. When I mean the fall, I'm not saying they're gonna go like gonna not exist tomorrow, but I mean the fall as far as like the separation within politics and then France is a very like politically attuned place, dude. Every shoot, like they're always having protests. It's a very protest pro country. People say how they
Yeah.
feel. They're more raw about it. Everyone like, well, from like even kids know that like it was crazy the times I went to like Paris and Nice. Like I heard like elementary school kids or primary school kids that could have been 10 or 11. They're like, oh, I don't know, dude. I don't know. I was listening to what the prime minister, I'm like, what the hell? Like, these are kids. They're having like
Yeah, yeah.
these like diverse conversations about, I think they were talking about inheritance and how like, I guess the way you do wills there's like layers too, where the government takes a percentage and they're like, oh, well, so what if that helps? And what if it's put into a pot? And they were having, I'm like, wow, these 10-year-olds, like, they're like, wow, and I know these are small sample sizes, but still, I'm like, I was like, yeah, they're always through kind of protests, and to see that them like shifting for Macron and like different things and all these like big shifts, it's yeah, I don't think people realize like the layers that nuclear deterrence has, and like, yeah, I can see why you have such an affinity towards this anime, and it dude, like it's like not what I expected at all, like in a good way, because like like for the first couple episodes, I'm like, oh, okay, it's kind of funny, and then it gets deeper. You meet all the different characters, and you're like, oh, damn. And
Oh.
one of my favorite scenes, I even let me see, I have a note here somewhere about it, which I think sums up the whole show. Um, as I even put it's an episode 10, 2 minutes and 45 seconds.
Oh.
I believe it's Trigun. I could be misquoted, but it's I made a note that balancing an egg on a gun is a great symbolism for a balance of life and death. I remember I forget so I wrote this down. Some characters balancing a gun on an egg, and arguably I think that's an easy way to kind of sum up the whole show, right? Whether and you can argue who's who at different points, right? If Vash is the egg, or maybe he's the gun and like the world's the egg, or maybe Knives is the gun and Vash is the egg, or the world's the egg, right? But Yeah, what oh, this is a good question since you're a dad now. Are you going to
Oh,
introduce this to your kids? And it's tricky, right? Because you have to do it at the right age. You want them to like get it. And luckily, as far as like sexualized stuff, this one isn't too bad. You don't have too many of those
no,
things, so you don't have to worry about that part of it. But it gets tricky as a parent, right? When are they ready, right? And then maybe as
that's
a
true. Yeah.
parent, or but I'm
Good
assuming
question.
you're going to introduce the show to them. Will you? Won't you? What are your thoughts on it? Or maybe manga first? How would you?
Yeah, like I'm pretty. I think we'll know when the time is right. Like they're very astute kids that I've got, but I think the age that I watched it was the perfect time. You know, I was just becoming politically aware enough that it started to kind of affect my thinking in some way. So I know I could leave it until uh, around that time, like 12, 13, 14, when these things start to become a bit more cool. Like this is going to be a vintage, it is a vintage anime. Like it's going to be, I think it's going to sustain itself as one of the better animes of all time. And especially in the 90s, there's this weird, like, it was Trigun and Cowboy Bebop, and there's another one that's really popular. It's kind of space western. They all came out within these 3 or 4 years in the 90s. There was something going on culturally there in Japan, whatever the heck it was. But um, yeah, I think at some point, when the time is right, definitely I will. And another thing I forgot to mention that hooked me immediately was the theme song. It's one of the most badass introductory theme songs. That appealed to my rock and roll
Oh,
upbringing.
sure.
So yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You guys that haven't checked it out, check out the theme song. It's just a
oh, it's a
hard
banger. Yeah.
nose guitar riff that, I think it's the reason why JC and I have facial hair. I think it just gives you
Yeah,
facial hair.
yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just like a
They put
beautiful
hair in your eyes, like yeah.
something, dude. Something, dude. It's for sure. No, and then yeah, and it's simple and it's great. No, sure, there's a lot of great 90s animes and like Neon Genesis, Evangelion too. But I
Oh
think
yeah.
there's also just this curiosity towards the future and the reimagining. And then Gundam has always been big for like a long time
Mhm.
too, which is another great thing too. Did you know when you were a kid that you were watching anime, or you just found that out later on, like, oh, this is an anime? Because I remember that happened to
Yeah.
me a lot as I grew up. I'm like, oh, I guess that wasn't. I just didn't realize it was an anime, or I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Like watching Pokemon, I never thought, oh, this is
Yeah,
Japanese or anime, that was just it was just a cartoon, something that you watched on TV. That's a good question. So probably no, I didn't. Maybe at the time of Trigun watching that, I did understand that that was a kind of phenomenon in itself. That's a good point. Yeah, that's something I hadn't thought of. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's just things I realize when like when people ask me, because like when someone asks me like when did I start writing anime, I kind of give credit to my wife because she's been a huge Studio Ghibli person since she was like a little
Oh yeah,
girl, and she's always the one like, oh, let's watch this one, let's watch this one, right? But when I actually think about it, I'm like, dude, I've been watching anime for forever, but not knowing that it was anime. Like, I grew up
mm.
watching like Speed Racer with my dad, and that was like
Yeah,
a
that's a good one. Yeah,
1960s. It's very simple. It's just he's racing to the point, and people are manipulating his car, or like villains. It's a very simple plot. But I watched it in Spanish, so even more reason. I'm like, I just thought it was an older cartoon that's like I don't know. And little did I know, I'm like, oh, it's from the 60s. I'm like, oh, damn, look at me watching an OG anime. I didn't know. And then another one too
hmm
was because my dad has always been a big martial arts head, and so whether we watched like boxing, different forms of combat, or like Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, different kung fu movies, 36 Chambers, but most in Spanish. Reminds you, all this stuff's in Spanish, and like so like I'm watching all this stuff, and then and one of these, I remember we finished watching. What was it? It had to have been Jackie Chan. Have you seen Meals on Wheels? Highly recommend
No,
that.
no, no.
And it sounds weird, but I guess they didn't call it oh wait, I said meal, but I think it's Meals on Wheels. I don't know. It's the order is weird because I guess they didn't want the title to start with the W because China's very superstitious, and all the titles that started with the W did bad in the box office. So I think they called it Meals on Wheels instead of, or no, Wheels on, I don't know. I'm mixing it up, whatever. One of the
Yeah.
best action fight scenes ever. Benny the Jet Urquidez is in it, and he's like the kickboxing champion, and they have an amazing fight scene. So me and my dad finished watching that, like, oh damn, that was badass. And then the next thing they put on the TV was Dragon Ball, and we didn't follow the plot, but we're just seeing these characters just like fighting each other super fast. We're like, holy crud! And I didn't know that was anime. I just thought I was watching this like badass cartoon.
Yeah, and Dragon Ball, there's a level of intensity to that show that you don't really
Yeah,
get anywhere else. Like literally
yeah.
20, 30 seconds of just screaming at each other, you know, it's like, whoa. Yeah, it's a real visceral
Yeah.
show that. Yeah, it's cool.
No, yeah, so yeah, I was just curious to hear your Trigon experience and just like with anime and stuff. But to kind of wrap it up on like a final point, is there any what do you think the lessons are of Trigon? You can relate it to like maybe Vash himself or another character or something like that, or just overall, or is there like a final point that you wanted to touch on, or just in general? What do you think like the lesson is of it, right? Because you leave the show
Yeah.
and it ends, and you're like, wow, dang, and it kind of it's a good ending, but it's a heartbreaking ending, right? And I don't know if you
Mm.
wanted to dive into it and whatnot, but yeah, what are your overall like like final thoughts, and what do you think is the message of this powerful anime?
Oh, that's a big question. I think, in retrospect, thinking about it as an adult now with kids, looking back at it, I think for me, it's the crux of it is all about um, the kind of subjective alienation of Ash. And I think the real key takeaway is that you need to have a certain amount of acceptance of how things are in order to be a complete and I say complete, but like a resolute human being, and I think that carries through any generation or any time frame. You know, the most compelling thing for me, aside from obviously the initial element of pacifism, is the fact that Vash is an incredibly open book, even though he might have difficulty kind of conveying his deeper traumas and feelings. He is he's kind of defiant to those traditional ideas of what masculinity is. He's quite goofy and verbose and silly. He makes a fool of himself. He's, as I said earlier, he has these really high ethical standards, but he slips himself. He binges on junk food and gets drunk, and you know he's inherently flawed, but also holds himself to a very high standard. So I'm kind of like, what's more human than that? We can all have these ideas about ourselves being liberals or lefties, but in reality, we're still excluding people, and we're still, we talk about conservatism. I think liberals and lefties are just as conservative as right wingers. So I'm kind of like, there's a lesson to be learned in alienation there, but that's something you should really lean into and not be afraid of feeling that way. So for me, that's the real core at the heart of the anime.
Very powerful assessment. Thank you for your response on identity and how, yeah, just having that self-awareness and like being yourself unapologetic. I think my takeaway was more of a question than like an actual thing. It was just like it kind of threw me off in a way, because it was kind of just this idea that like, do people change? I think people can change. I think people have the ability to change. With the nature and nurture debate, I've always been a big nurture guy, because I don't think it matters how you start, it's how you finish. I think you can always make changes and stuff. But then, like, I feel like that anime just left me with the question at the end. It's like, did they even change, or did both
Mm,
people see their ideals, Knives and Vash, until the very end? And maybe like maybe Knives was never the villain, but he did what he felt was necessary until he realized that, oh, okay, this is what I have to do, right? Or
mm,
realizing that his love for his brother was more important than his ultimate plan, and maybe realizing, I guess I do love this guy, and maybe he wanted to protect um Vash's ideal, right? And so that was the part too, or it kind of, I don't know. There's a lot to like. I don't know. Did he change, or maybe he didn't change, or maybe he never was who he said he was. That's a big thing too. I think a lot of
Mm,
people bark louder than they realize, and when push comes to shove, it's like, oh, I guess it's not what I really wanted, right? And I think we've
mhm,
all been there as people, whether it's in like a relationship with a person that we like, whether you're trying a food, it's like, sometimes the hype, the ideal of the food, and then you have the food, and then you're like disappointed, like, oh, I guess it's not what I wanted, and I thought
yeah, yeah.
it's what
But I
I
think
wanted.
there's always that inherent desire that you have that you can't quite vanquish. Even though you
Sure.
might have these moral ideals about how to be, how to live. But um, I think actually this is where Slavoj Zizek is really useful because he talks
Mm,
about how um, the dominion of violence is actually the dominion of love. He makes a point.
mm,
Actually, I'll draw it back to Vash's catchphrase, "Love and peace." That's actually kind of an oxymoron because you can't have love and peace because love needs cruelty, and cruelty can be loving. So there's this kind of weird, again, sort of yin yang going on that uh, in reality, violence is kind of made out of love in a sense. You want things to be a certain way and you'll strive for that to a point, to the detriment of others most of the time. And if you're, for example, if you love this girl, like she's really hot or whatever, and you're like in this mindset of like, I'd do anything for her. But then you get your heart broken and it's like, love is cruel. It's true. Um, I think there's an element that people, I guess, maybe oversimplify the idea of compassion. When you think about the root of compassion, it's like suffering together, compassion. So it's kind of like you have to be open to the idea of suffering and, you know, serving pain to others when they need it to happen. And maybe that comes into, we're talking about martial arts. There's an element of discipline within that where you're never going to go to the extent of killing the person, because you care about them. So I don't know if you have something to add to that, but
sure. Wow, that's wow, amazing poetry. Thank you so much for your time again. Wow, this is yeah, we're having a very strong conclusion here. Absolutely. Yes, yeah, and the martial art side of it, which is arguably part of Trigon as well, because I would argue they are martial artists and their weapon of choice is a gun. But there's other people that use different weapons. We have like a puppeteer, we have a samurai, we have a swordsman, right? The idea, martial art, it's in its simplest definition, it just means an artist of war, right? Martial art.
mm,
But then, martial could have another definition too. Martial can also mean leadership. So how you define leadership is completely up to the individual. And as far as the whole concept of like hurting each other in violence, yeah, there's an ironic poetry because we've been training for martial arts for over a decade or so, and there's some of the most laid back, coolest people you'd ever meet, which is
mhm,
counterintuitive, right? You watch enough movies and film, you see most of them have some kind of ego trips. Yeah, some of them exist in the martial art community. I wouldn't say they don't, but they're a minority and not the majority because martial arts teaches you hardship and it forces you to form a relationship to hardship and hardship becomes a norm because there's nothing easy about martial arts. It's as hard as it looks, it's as hard as it sounds. It's like it's doing the thing every day, and I think it's another way of illustrating your point about the love and peace and the whole conflict. And lovers are warriors because to your comment, right, whether it's a hot girl or guy, whatever you into, non-gender binary or whatever, yeah, whatever floats your boat, if like you're willing to fight for that person, right? And like that fight also requires a lot of you. And yeah, you're not gonna you're gonna keep after it. And just like in martial arts, the pursuit of having body awareness and awareness of your opponent, or as you're training, learn different moves, the constant exposure to violence actually makes you nonviolent, which is probably what happened to Vash too. Because once you see the violence, once you live the violence, all you want is
mm,
peace. It makes you more peaceful. It makes you more mellow because you've seen the ugliness, right? It's like
mm, Oh, it's interesting you say ugly there, because when you think about the scars in his body that he tries to conceal, it's kind of like, what's that book by that guy? The Body Keeps the Score. It's all about how your body retains the effects of trauma. It's your job to reconcile with that and accept that. So yeah, it's an interesting comparison.
No, right. No, absolutely. And it's like, yeah, you have that relationship to it. So it makes sense. It makes sense why yeah, the whole love peace and the whole cruelty thing too. That's another thing too, right? Just the kind of another thing too is that yeah, like love doesn't have to always literally be cruel, but I guess there's a cruelty in love because there's a harvesting process, right? It's easy to it's easy to love your partner for 2, 3 years, right? You're still kind of the puppy dog phase. But can you love your partner when you're poor, when you're obsolete, when you have nothing going on, when you're striving to a goal and you're trying to better yourselves and you don't know if you're going to make it? You don't know if you're going to figure it out financially, but you have the desire, the hopes, and the ambitions.
Mm.
Can you still harvest that tree of love with your partner? It's hard to plant a tree. I think it takes the average tree like 10 to 11 years to grow. That's a long time.
Hmm.
And
Oh yeah,
like
yeah.
to be able to be with that person throughout that, and it's not easy because it's like you guys are two families coming together, and every family has their own sense of like tribulations and shame and baggage and all this trauma happening at the same time. So to your point, his catchphrase of, quest of love and peace, it's like oversimplifying it. And it's easier said than done. It's nice to like have that be a motto, but like in practice and execution, it's so much harder than we believe. But that's what makes it sweet, right? It's it's it's
Oh
it's
yeah.
the it's the fight that makes it worth it. Like 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 me and my wife, we celebrated like being 12 years together, and it hasn't always. Thank you. And it hasn't always been easy, but thanks through a lot of personal development, and we've done couples therapy too, and just because we love each other so dang much, like it's awesome, dude. I honestly feel like I really fell in love with her again with this last year or
Mm.
so, and not because of who she is, but who she's becoming, and like appreciating that growth, and just like
And
wow.
that's reciprocal, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks. I hope so.
I think so. I think it is. Yeah, it needs to be. That's what cultivating these things is all about. And it's the
Absolutely.
same with
No, yeah.
friendships or family relationships. It's all about you put in the
Yeah,
work and you reap the benefits. So
absolutely. So, yeah, yeah. No, I was just teasing about the bad joke, hopefully. No, absolutely. Yeah, of course things work out in that way, but do you have any final thoughts or any closing thoughts on Trigon or anything else that you wanted to hit on or touch on as we wrap up?
uh, yeah, go and watch it and have your life changed.
There you go. Yeah, I don't think I have too much to add. Thank you so much for checking out this interview. Uh, yeah, definitely check out the anime, and yeah, leave us a comment. Tell us your thoughts about what you think about it. If there's any other animes or everything else that you want to talk about. Do you guys agree with our stances? Do you disagree? Are we just saying a bunch of nonsense and like these guys are crazy? Not a problem. Go ahead and let's create a conversation and have a discourse in the comment sections below. But yeah, thank you for checking out another AZ Ray video. You guys have an amazing day, and don't forget to like and subscribe.